Welcome to another conversation on the All About You podcast. And this podcast is really special because this is a podcast to mark the first birthday of the All About You podcast. So my guest today is myself, but my husband, is here with me, and we're going to be having a conversation about the All About You podcast. So Pete, welcome to the All About You podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me. I feel a bit like Michael Parkinson sitting here now, having to do the interview, but something a bit different. So, how does it feel having done a podcast for over a year?
Well, I have to say, I am sitting here grinning from ear to ear. I think it's one of the best things I've ever done. I've learnt so much, and I've had some brilliant guests, and it's been a great education. And you were actually my very first guest back in December 2020.
I was, yes, indeed. That seems an eons ago.
It seems a long time for you as well.
Yes, yeah. So well done anyway, well done.
Well, thank you. I mean, I just absolutely adore it. It's one of the best things ever.
I did a little bit of research, actually, just to show how good an achievement this is, because I'm sure you don't realise it. There are actually 2 million podcasters out there, apparently, of which 50% of them are no longer active. So the fact that you've kept going is quite an achievement. And,
wow.
And indeed, 20% of those podcasters don't make it past the second podcast.
Yes, I have to say, I did come across that fact quite early on.
So the fact that you've done 52 by now, one a week for a whole year, is quite an achievement. So well done.
Oh, thank you very much.
So that begs a big question. Where do you find all your guests from?
Oh, that's my favourite part, is finding my guests. I think when I started out, a lot of it was people I knew who had done incredible things. They'd travelled or worked in another country. I've had some authors. And I think sometimes I come across somebody in a conversation and I do my best to get them on a podcast. Other things, I come up with a wish list and then I try and find somebody who can talk about that. And I hope by using those methods there is something that's going to appeal to everybody on the All About You podcast. Because I think it's quite wide ranging in the topic. So people, I hope, will just look through all the different podcasts and cherry pick something that appeals to them. That's my objective.
So you don't necessarily expect somebody to listen to every single podcast of yours. It's more...
That would be lovely, but I think in reality, I think very much myself, that yes, there are podcasts that I follow, but even so, if I look on there, and most of the platforms will automatically, when you subscribe, send you the latest podcast. But often, if I don't fancy that topic, I will scroll through and cherry pick. So I'm more than happy for people to do that. And I think this is the beauty of a podcast. You can either listen to every single one that somebody does by subscribing, and then you automatically get their latest podcast to your phone or to your computer. But cherry picking, I think, is a great way. Because although you may follow a podcast with a theme, you're probably not going to relate to every single podcast they do. So cherry picking, I think is fantastic.
Yeah. So I know you've done quite a variety of subjects, like people's hobbies, people's work, people's passions, and as well as people's traumas. Has any of the podcasts really surprised you? Ones that you thought maybe weren't going to be that interesting, but actually turned out to be amazing?
Now this is where I actually start to feel quite emotional. Yes, there's been a lot of podcasts that have been quite difficult to listen to. I think particularly the podcast I did with Anne Graham, which was talking about supporting her son through mental illness. That was an amazing podcast to do, and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to sit down with Anne and hear her story. And that was incredibly emotional, and even now I can feel the emotion I felt when I was with Anne doing that podcast. I think one of the most recent ones is the story of Louise McLaughlin, who found out that she was donor conceived. We did that as a two-part podcast. So I feel incredibly privileged to be able to tell those people's stories. They are very traumatic and they are incredibly personal. So those particularly were very, very emotional podcasts to do.
Are these people that, or do these people feel that this is like the first time they've been able to tell their story, or are they people that have already told it on a regular basis and just want to explain it again?
I think with Anne's podcast talking about supporting her son, that was the first podcast she had done, and the book hadn't been out that long. So I think that was particularly a difficult podcast for Anne to do.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as I say, I feel incredibly privileged to have the opportunity to do that podcast. The podcast with Louise McLaughlin, she is a journalist. She did her own podcast, You Look Like Me, which is how I found her. So she's a true professional. Mm-hmm. So yeah, both amazing podcasts.
Yeah. So that presumably answers another question, that are some people easier to interview than others?
I don't think I've ever had anybody who's been difficult to interview. And for me, it's not necessarily an interview. I'd like to think it's more of a conversation, because the idea of All About You is you do the talking, the guest does the talking, not me. Every podcast is different, every conversation is different, and I think it's a great thing to do. I absolutely love it. Yeah, mm-hmm. And I hope they enjoy the experience as well. I think a lot of guests are, I've never done a podcast before, I don't know what to do, and I'm very nervous. After a few minutes, they forget about the microphone, they get into the rhythm of doing the podcast, and 9 times out of 10 afterwards they say, wow, that went really quickly, I really enjoyed it. So I hope it's a good experience for everybody.
Okay, good. So on that subject, do you want to talk about the processes involved in doing a podcast? Because I'm sure a lot of people listening maybe listen to podcasts on a regular basis, but don't actually know what's involved in producing one. So do you want to give us a brief rundown?
Well, I have to say, when I started my podcast, the reason I hadn't done it earlier is because I was terrified of the technology. I'm not a great fan of technology, I don't understand it, and I knew there was going to be a lot of technical stuff involved. However, thanks to you, wonderful husband, you sort of worked out how you do a podcast and how you get it out there. And then you sort of showed me how to do it, and I'm sort of off and running. So for me particularly, the technical side is probably the least enjoyable part, doing the editing. It's only because it takes time. I want to make it as perfect as I can, and that's probably the bit that takes the time.
Just on that, I've heard that a lot of people actually just record the podcast and pass it on to a team that does all the background work for you. If I wasn't around, would you consider doing that, or do you prefer doing it on your own? Because you do it all on your own now. I may have started doing it for you, but you've learned how to do everything, so you're in control from start to finish now.
Yes, I am in control from start to finish. As I said, I think the editing is my least favourite part, but I'm feeling more confident now I'm learning the editing side. I think for me as well, social media, that's something I really wasn't into. And yes, I had Facebook and Instagram, and yes, I can like and thumbs up something, but when you start working with the podcast, there's a little bit more to it than that. my actual word for this year was growth, and I think I've certainly fulfilled that with the podcast. And probably nobody actually realises at the moment, but I'm in the process of putting all the podcasts onto YouTube, because apparently YouTube is really coming on as one of the main areas people listen to podcasts now, as well as the typical things like Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, etc., etc. So the editing is probably my least favourite part. I think my favourite part is going after guests. I get an idea, this is somebody I want to have on the podcast, sending them an email, having a pre-podcast conversation with them and working it out, especially when you're dealing with time differences. America's a huge country, so you really have to be on the ball. Which coast are they on, and what's the time difference? So that's my favourite part, is sourcing the guests.
And presumably those in America and around the world are done via Zoom or Skype or phone contacts, whatever.
Yes, I think that's an amazing thing, because when I started the podcast, I sort of made a list of people I knew and things that I thought they could speak about and I thought would be really interesting. But when we started in December 2020, we were in the middle of a pandemic, so I then got approached by someone in America, David, who did the Cycle of Life for raising money and awareness for cancer, and he approached me from America, and that was the first time it sort of crossed my mind we could do a podcast using Skype and Zoom, and then we were up and running. So yeah, distance is no problem now. The world's your oyster. Yeah.
Okay. So has there been any surprises along the way?
Oh, masses of surprises, and every single one from my guests. My guests are just the best ever. They are all brilliant, they are all different. We've had laughter, we've had tears. Yeah, I mean, my guests are just the best. That's why I do it, because it's the opportunity to speak to people about their travels, their passions, things that they're interested in. And yeah, that's the best thing. That's the reason I do it, because of the guests.
And you've mentioned the worst bit for you is the technology side of it. Have you had any really difficult moments during interviews that you thought, oh God, this is a disaster? Or even have you had technological breakdowns where it's just you've had to abandon it?
I don't think I have, no. I think when you're doing a podcast, depending on where you are and whether you're doing it face-to-face or Skype, often you'll get jangling bracelets or scraping of chairs and squeaky desks and things like that. But I mean, that's all a learning curve. Basically I'm recording either face-to-face with a MacBook or with a MacBook and a microphone. So I haven't got mega expensive equipment. And it's very interesting when you ask me the question about, if you weren't around, would I do it myself or would I employ somebody? When you look at some of the podcasters out there, they go to a studio, they've got a production team, they've got this microphone and they've got this gizmo and all the rest of it. You can spend an awful lot of money on equipment. You can spend an awful lot of money in having sound engineers, studio time, producers, etc., etc., which is great if you do have those options, but I haven't got that. I'm limited to my microphone and my MacBook, and I would like to think the quality's okay. Obviously quality is an issue, but using the equipment I've got, I think we're okay. I hope we're okay.
Okay. And do you think by doing all the editing and the whole thing yourself now, do you think that's made you better at doing a podcast? Because you can appreciate difficulties that may come into the production side?
That's an interesting question. I think it's been very much a learning curve doing the podcast, and I think I've learned more about doing a podcast from my guests as opposed to the technology, because when you are working with somebody else, every guest is different. Some of them are really, really comfortable speaking and telling their story. Some of the guests like to have their notes. Some want you to send them the questions in advance, or often I will say to a guest, okay, you send me the questions, and maybe I'll throw one or two in there you're not expecting to sort of make it quite natural. So I think my guests have taught me to be a better podcaster. I hope I've improved. Maybe I should listen back to our very first podcast.
I know that first one because, as you said, you interviewed me for the first one. I don't think there was any editing in that. It was just straight off and put it out there. No,
well, that's the thing, because I was, okay, we've done the podcast, but no, we can't release it, and you just pressed the button to put it out there. So that was completely unedited, but, you know, I'm not a professional podcaster. I'm not even sure I call myself a podcaster. I say I have a podcast, but I say I'm a podcaster.
I think someone who's done it for a year is probably counts as a podcaster.
Well, I think I'm very much on the bottom runs of it, but boy, what a year has it been. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah, good. You just talked about the money some people spend on producing the podcast and all the equipment they buy. And obviously they make money from their podcasts. Has that ever been a consideration of yours?
No, it hasn't, no. I do understand. I mean, I'm trying to sort of learn more about the podcasting world, and when I'm understanding more about that world, one of the main things is people are trying to monetize their podcast. Now, there are several things you can do once you get to so many thousand subscribers. Sponsors may approach you where you would put an advert in the middle of your podcast and they would pay you for that. A lot of podcasters would do Patreon, where people will pay and you may do like a second podcast just for those Patreon people. Other people will do a buy me a coffee, which basically you put a link into your podcast, and if people like your podcast, they can sort of send you £1 or €1 or $1 or something. That's quite a good idea, because if you want to upgrade your equipment, or you want to use a studio to improve the quality, or you just want to make a bit of money from doing a podcast, because it does take a lot of time, it does take a lot of commitment. So I can understand why people say, okay, if I'm going to have a podcast, I do want to make money from it. But that's not my idea.
So if someone wants to buy you a cup of coffee, they'll have to do it in person rather than through your podcast.
Oh, well, that's a good question, isn't it? I don't know. Let's see if it happens, and then we'll see what we're going to do about that one.
Okay. So next year, where are you going to get... Who are you going to ask for your podcasts? What plans have you got for new topics, new subjects?
One thing I would love to do, which would be to combine my love of travel and podcasting. And hopefully, as we're coming out of the pandemic situation and the possibility of travelling next year, I would love, whenever I'm going somewhere, whether I'm going to the UK or travelling within Spain, is to take that opportunity to do face-to-face podcasts with people. And I think over the last year, a lot of podcasts I have done have been via Skype and Zoom, and it would be absolutely amazing to actually meet those people face-to-face, and I will buy them a coffee to say thank you. So very much I would love to meet some of the guests face to face that I did over Skype.
And would you do a follow-up podcast with them again.
That would be
So
a
you could do
brilliant
part
idea.
two.
Yeah, part 2 face to face. Yeah. Oh God, I would so love that. I would so love that. I'm already thinking of all the people I've done Skype with. Yeah, absolutely. And I will buy them a coffee.
Looks like we're going to do a lot of travelling next year now.
Well, that would be good. That would be good.
Okay, go back to, you mentioned you're putting your podcast on YouTube. How difficult a decision was that? And have you had to change anything for the YouTube podcast as opposed to a radio podcast?
I have to be completely honest and say a huge thank you to Antoinetta, because she was a guest on the podcast. She's a jewellery designer and she made the beautiful fishbone necklace for Britney Spears. And she's got a YouTube channel, that's how I found her. And she said to me, "Why is your podcast not on YouTube?" And I really didn't have an answer. So really, she gave me the idea. You worked out how to do it because you're the technical genius. And yeah, the podcast is now going slowly. I'm moving them all over. I've got 50 odd to do, so it's taking a bit of time. But yeah, so now it's on YouTube. I don't think I actually need to do anything different with the podcast. It's just another set of things I need to do. Every time I publish a podcast, then I need to make sure it goes on to YouTube. So it's another bit I've added to the process of publishing the podcast.
Because you're not actually showing the video of the interview, are you? It's
No,
just
no,
some
it's
stills with them.
Yeah, it's purely still an audio podcast, but that's the interesting thing. Maybe that is something for the future where I'm doing face-to-face or Skype with a guest, that we actually do put the video on YouTube. So a lot of podcasters will do that. If they're using Skype or Zoom or even face-to-face, they do put the actual interview as such with face-to-face as a video on YouTube. So yeah, maybe that's something else to think about next year. If the guest is comfortable with that. I know not everybody is comfortable with the video, they're happy with just the audio. So I think that's an option for the guest.
Yeah, I should imagine for some people being in front of a camera could be quite difficult and unnerving, and obviously it would also then add another layer of editing, which could make it much more difficult to produce. So maybe stick to the audio one for a while. But
I think with YouTube, I mean, YouTube is great because in theory it is audio visual, but a podcast is not necessarily a visual thing as well. So I think it's another way to get the podcast out to people. I think generally podcasts you may listen when you're travelling, you're in the gym, you're working around the house, whatever. You don't need to sit and watch that on the screen. And I guess with the same with YouTube, you just put it on in the background while you're doing whatever. So I don't suppose many people would sit and actually watch a conversation with another person, but I could be wrong.
yeah, I must admit, did a little bit of research before this, and the statistics said that most people, or not most people, but a significant number of people listen to podcasts whilst in the car or whilst doing things around the house. So YouTube obviously doesn't lend itself to that. So maybe it's just, as you said, another way of people to listen to it rather than a visual thing, primarily anyway. Next question. How do you go about publicising your podcast? How do you get your listeners?
That's a good question as well. I think the podcast goes out on various platforms like Spotify, Google Podcasts, iTunes, for example. But I know there are some people who are not particularly au fait with technology. So every week I do send out an email on a Sunday evening when the podcast is published at 7 o'clock, an email will go out with a short introduction about the guest and a link to the podcast. So that will go to people's phones and computers, and all they have to do is click on the link, because if they're not into YouTube or iTunes or Spotify and subscribing, that's an easy way for them to listen. So obviously I've got a Facebook, I've got an Instagram channel, and now we've got YouTube. So really just hoping that people will subscribe to the podcast, they will like the podcast, and ideally share the podcast. I would like to think if somebody has been a guest on the All About You podcast, they will then send that podcast, whether they're sharing or via email, to their family and friends. And hopefully their family and friends will listen, and then they may sort of scroll through, see what else is there, and cherry pick another podcast. So I think you're very much relying on other people liking and sharing, and maybe talking about your podcast to other people.
Yeah, so it's going to grow naturally rather than, because I mean obviously you can spend a fortune on the advertising bit, and if you're not making any money out of it, then it's very difficult. But if your ideal is not to make money, then as long as it keeps growing, then that's achieved your aim, I think.
I mean, I think with a lot of podcasters, it's their main job, it's their main income. They maybe will have a YouTube channel, which is maybe a spin-off. They'll write an ebook, they'll write courses that you can buy, they'll do downloads of courses, and you buy a monthly subscription or something like that, or Patreon, all these different things. So I think there's different levels of podcasting. I mean, when you look at some of the top podcasters, and they've got, you know, millions of people who listen, and, you know, it's a whole empire.
Yeah.
It's a whole empire.
But that's probably like everything, the elite, if you could call them that, the elite podcasters, it's only probably the top 2% of people that are doing it. The everybody else is fairly normal, and just it grows organically rather than spending a fortune.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's an endless amount of money you can spend on podcasts. I mean, my logo is pretty basic, and thank you very much, Cameron. You did a brilliant job on the logo for me. I didn't have a problem asking people to help me, and people were great. It's like Cameron said, I will do the logo for you, and he did it, and we've still got that logo. And I'm very proud of my logo. Yes, it could be some WYSIWYG, jazzy, whatever, but that's not what I'm all about. You know, I'm a very, very small fish in a huge pond. But as I grow, it's, you know, this is my first year, and it's been incredible. It's all about the guests. That's what my podcast is all about. I'm not going for world domination, but it's the guests. That's what motivates me. That makes every podcast different, and yeah, it's just down to the guests.
Yeah, and I think that comes across in the way you talk to them, and you know, it comes across as very natural, and just listening to their stories. So
I hope so, because I'm just so honoured, I'm so proud, I am blessed, and so thankful with all the people that have been on the All About You podcast in the last year. I just cannot thank you enough. It's been amazing, and I'm very much looking forward to the second year on the All About You podcast.
Well, yes, that was going to be my next thing. Are you planning any changes, or just keep doing more of the same?
I don't think there's particularly any changes, because
you don't need any changes.
The podcast is people telling their stories, and I don't want to change that. That's exactly what the podcast is. The nucleus of the podcast is people telling their stories. Hopefully I will get better as a podcaster. Hopefully my skills will improve in delivering the podcast and the quality. and I would hope very much to combine my love of travel and the opportunity to meet more people face to face. One thing I really hope is that, yes, I do get the opportunity for all those people that I've done podcasts with Skype or Zoom, that I do get to meet you in person, and I will buy you a coffee. Just one thing before we finish, I just want to say congratulations on your podcast, husband, Our Dad's Stamps.
Yeah, well, that probably wouldn't have happened without your input, so thank you. But it seems to be going well at the moment. So obviously that's a different type of podcast because it is aimed solely stamp collectors, so it's a bit of a niche market, but yeah, hopefully it's working well.
Right, so let's just do a little quick thing on yours. So Our Dad's Stamps, why is it called Our Dad's Stamps?
Our Dad's Stamps started because although I've always collected stamps, the big moment came when we inherited my dad's and your dad's collections. So the whole thing became the collection of our dads, so Our Dad's Stamps. And it's developed into, I don't say a small business, but a big hobby where I buy and sell stamps to fund more purchases, and on the strength of that my collection has grown and my love of stamps has grown again.
So we are now a podcast family. We've got my All About You podcast, we've got your Our Dad's Stamps podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your plans for your podcast for next year?
Well, just to keep going, I think. I'm enjoying doing it, and I did get some nice feedback from people who've enjoyed listening to the stories about stamps. And even if you're not a stamp collector, there are some interesting stories in there about various things that happen, so give it a try.
So one thing I would just like to say at the end of this podcast, if you listen to the podcast and you enjoy it, please can you subscribe, please give me a thumbs up, please give me a like on social media. I would really, really appreciate it.
Yes, and I would say likewise as well, if you get around to listen to mine, I hope you enjoy it.
And I'm looking forward to the second year of the All About You podcast.
Good luck with your next years of podcast, and we'll come back again this time next year and record the second anniversary.
We might
podcast.
be in Acapulco next year.
Well, we'll do it from Acapulco then.
I hope you have enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget, if you have a story you would like to tell, please get in touch. My email address is allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com, and thank you for listening.